Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really significant time, the era of the baby boomer generation. We're looking at the huge shifts that happened then, both in society generally and specifically within the Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's a period with long shadows, you could say.
Absolutely. We've got a source document here, babyboomers.txt, which gives a particular Catholic viewpoint. It asks if the changes back then were unprecedented in how fast they happened and what they involved.
Right. Was it something completely new or just an acceleration?
Exactly. So our mission today is to explore that. We want to understand what things were like before the boomers came of age.
Lay the groundwork.
Then pinpoint the big changes they were part of, look at the speed of it all, and think about the lasting effects, especially for Catholics. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. This era definitely still shapes conversations today, in the church and outside it.
So to really get a handle on the boomer impact, we need that baseline. What was the world like just before, say, after World War II?
Well, the source paints a picture of optimism, sure, rebuilding, but underneath, it emphasizes a pretty high degree of social stability.
Stability. Okay, so not just rebuilding buildings, but a settled social order.
Yeah, that's the idea presented. And the source highlights two anchors, family and the church. They were apparently central in setting the norms.
So family structure.
Yeah.
What did that look like according to the source?
More stable, generally. Roles within the family were often more clearly defined. That classic nuclear family model was, the standard people looked to.
Right, and the church's role. It wasn't just Sunday Mass, was it?
Oh, definitely not. The source argues the Catholic faith was really woven into the social fabric. It influenced customs, social expectations, even laws in many places.
Like it was just part of the air you breathed back then for many Catholics.
Pretty much. And tradition was key. It provided continuity, a shared identity passed down through generations.
And this passing down worked well. Faith, liturgy.
Yeah.
The source mentions the Latin Mass being dominant then.
Yes, it describes a very effective intergenerational transmission. Kids learned the faith at home, at Mass, and the culture often reinforced it. It was a whole ecosystem in a way.
Interesting. What about the general mindset, the worldview back then?
The source points to a strong emphasis on duty, on sacrifice, and a core belief in objective moral truth.
Objective truth, meaning?
Meaning the idea that right and wrong weren't just opinions. They were seen as grounded in natural law, sort of inherent moral principles you could reason out, believed to be part of God's design, and also in divine revelation, what God explicitly taught.
So sense of obligation to God, family, community, a shared moral compass, perhaps?
That's the picture the source paints, yes. A shared understanding of right and wrong was more common.
Okay, so that's the foundation. Stable, traditional, faith-integrated, shared morals. Now, the shifts begin. The source really points to the demographic and sexual revolutions as huge game changers.
Absolutely, especially viewed through that Catholic lens, because they hit right at the core of teachings on marriage, family, and, life itself.
And a key moment seems to be Humanae Vitae in 1968.
Definitely. Pope Paul VI encyclical reaffirming the ban on artificial contraception. It landed like a bombshell for some.
Why such a big reaction?
Well, the source highlights the widespread dissent that followed. And crucially, it wasn't just lay people. A lot of priests, theologians too, openly disagreed or questioned it.
That sounds significant. A break in unity.
It certainly caused deep divisions. And the source argues this dissent led to contraception becoming normalized, even common among Catholic families, despite the official teaching.
So a kind of divergence between official teaching and actual practice.
Yes, and perhaps the start of a more, let's say, pick-and-choose approach to faith for some.
And this ties into other big societal changes happening around the same time.
It does. Think about legalized abortion. Roe v. Wade in the U.S. in '73 is the landmark, but the debates were building before that. The boomer generation was right in the thick of those arguments.
And that created a direct conflict with church teaching on the sanctity of life from conception.
Right. A head-on collision, really. The church's consistent teaching versus a rapidly changing legal and social landscape.
The source also connects these things to falling birth rates.
Dramatically falling, yes. In many Western countries, birth rates dropped below replacement level during this period.
Below replacement.
Yeah.
What are the implications of that?
Well, societal ones, like age in populations, workforce shrinkage down the line. But the source also stresses the impact on the church. Fewer babies meant eventually fewer Catholics, fewer potential priests and nuns.
I see. Fewer young people overall means a smaller pool for vocations. Makes sense.
Exactly. And add to that the rise in divorce rates, more single-parent households. The traditional family structure was changing rapidly.
And then there's the sexual revolution itself.
Right. Greater acceptance of sex outside marriage, casual encounters, pornography becoming more accessible, all starkly contrasting with traditional Christian sexual ethics.
The source actually provides some data on this, doesn't it? U.S. figures.
It does. A table showing birth rates going down, divorce rates going up, fertility rates dropping between 1950 and 1990. Seeing the numbers really drives home how fast and deep these changes were.
Yeah, numbers don't lie on trends like that. Okay, so massive societal shifts. Now, the source uses pretty strong language for what happened within the church after the Second Vatican Council. It talks about a liturgical and ecclesial collapse.
It does, and it's important, like you said earlier, to frame this. The source notes this is a perspective often held by more traditionalist Catholics.
Right, so their argument is about the implementation of Vatican II.
Yes. The council itself ended in 1965. The debate, according to this view, is about what happened next. They argue that some interpretations and changes went far beyond what the Council Fathers intended, leading to confusion, division, and, well, what they see as a collapse.
What specific things are they pointing to?
Things like what they'd call the destruction of traditional sacred music, like Gregorian chant or polyphony, replaced by newer styles. Big changes in church design, removing altar rails, changing sanctuary layouts, a perceived decline in reverence during Mass itself.
For someone holding that view, it must have felt like the ground shifted beneath their feet.
Profoundly unsettling, yes. They saw it as losing something beautiful, sacred, and deeply connected to tradition.
And the source connects this perceived liturgical upheaval to other trends.
It does. It suggests a link between these changes in falling Mass attendance and the rise of what's sometimes called cafeteria Catholicism, that pick-and-choose approach we mentioned.
Okay. And the drop in priests and nuns.
That's a huge piece of it from this perspective. A dramatic collapse in vocations, leading to very real consequences. Parishes closing or merging. Catholic schools shutting down. Fewer clergy to serve the remaining faithful.
It sounds like a downward spiral in their view.
That's the picture painted. They also mention a shift in spirituality. A perceived move towards something more individualistic, maybe focused on feeling good, personal experience, rather than, say, repentance, awe before the sacredness of God, the Holy One of Israel, as the source puts it.
Less emphasis on traditional disciplines.
Yeah, they note a decline in things like regular confession, Eucharistic adoration, traditional forms of fasting or penance, what used to be called mortification. A different spiritual emphasis seemed to take hold.
Okay, so that's the ecclesial side. Now, the source talks about the broader culture, associating the boomers with the rise of the me culture.
Yes, a big focus on individualism, personal autonomy, self-fulfillment as the primary goals in life.
Which sounds quite different from that earlier emphasis on duty and sacrifice we discussed.
A very sharp contrast. The source juxtaposes the traditional "thy will be done," seeking God's will, with a more modern ethos of do what makes you happy. A fundamental shift in priority from community and obligation to the self.
And this ties into morality.
Directly. The source links this individualism to a decline in belief in objective moral truth. The rise of moral relativism, the idea that morality is subjective, relative to the individual or culture.
Pope Benedict XVI spoke about the dictatorship of relativism, didn't he?
He did, famously. And this source echoes that concern, suggesting this me culture fostered an environment where absolute rights and wrongs were increasingly questioned or rejected.
What about things like self-expression?
The source talks about a cult of self-expression and the influence of therapeutic culture. The argument isn't that self-expression or well-being are bad, but that they might have started to overshadow older virtues like obedience, holiness, striving for virtue.
So traditional moral teachings might seem restrictive.
Exactly. Perceived less as guardrails leading to true freedom and flourishing, and more as outdated restrictions on personal autonomy and happiness.
It's a fundamental change in perspective.
Yeah.
The source also brings technology into this, specifically television.
Right, noting the boomers were the first generation really raised with TV from childhood.
And the potential impact.
The source raises questions about maybe increased social isolation despite the screen connecting people in other ways, perhaps more passivity, less time for quiet reflection or reading, just the constant presence of broadcast media changing how people processed information and spent their time.
And then consumerism.
A huge factor, according to the source, the rise of consumer culture, where identity gets tied up with brands, possessions, lifestyle choices.
How does that impact faith?
Well, the argument is that this focus on the material can undermine spiritual identity. If you define yourself by what you own or consume, maybe faith takes a back seat. Plus, the secularization of Sunday becoming just another day for shopping or leisure, not primarily for rest and worship.
It all seems interconnected.
Very much so. The source also touches on the idea of progress itself during that era.
Meaning?
Meaning that progress was often equated with discarding the past, a sense that newer is always better, which could lead to a disregard, even contempt, for tradition.
Including traditions related to beauty or reverence.
Yes, the source suggests a potential scorning of beauty, reverence, even silence, both in secular life and filtering into religious life as well, from this viewpoint.
Okay, leading to another strong phrase from the source. The collapse of the moral imagination. What's meant by that?
It seems to refer to a shrinking capacity to perceive and value traditional moral and cultural norms. The source points to potential shifts in academia, maybe prioritizing ideology over traditional wisdom, or presenting history in a way that undermines past values.
And the broader culture.
Discusses a questioning or rejection of the traditional Western cultural canon, the great books, art, music that formed previous generations, the potential consequence being a loss of shared cultural identity, more fragmentation.
And traditional values themselves.
The source notes a perceived mocking or devaluing of traditional roles and virtues, things like virginity before marriage, the vocation of motherhood, and often negative portrayals of clergy in movies and media.
Wow. It really is painting a picture of profound cultural upheaval viewed through this particular lens. So what does the source see as the outcome, the legacy of all this? It uses the term fruits.
And the assessment isn't overly positive, it's fair to say. It talks about subsequent generations, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, inheriting a kind of spiritual confusion, possibly linking it to rising anxiety, a search for meaning.
And the church as an institution.
Points to the visible signs, emptying churches in many Western countries, school closures, having to sell off property, institutional fragility resulting from these trends.
The source also mentions church leadership during that time.
It raises a somewhat pointed critique, suggesting perhaps a degree of moral cowardice among some Boomer-era leaders, a reluctance to strongly uphold traditional teachings in the face of cultural pressure.
That's a strong claim.
It is, and it leads to the idea of an inheritance of silence and apostasy. Meaning, if Boomer parents didn't effectively pass on the faith, their children often drifted away. A significant loss of faith in subsequent generations is highlighted.
So a real break in that transmission chain that seemed so strong before.
That's the core argument about the legacy, yes. A dramatic decline in belief and practice over a relatively short historical span.
Finally, the source attempts a theological diagnosis. It brings up Pope Benedict again.
Yes, his idea of two ways of interpreting Vatican II, the hermeneutic of continuity versus the hermeneutic of rupture.
Can you break that down quickly? Hermeneutic just means?
A way of interpreting. So continuity sees Vatican II as developing organically from the Church's long tradition, growing, but not breaking from the past.
But rupture
Sees Vatican II as a fundamental break, a fresh start, something radically new that supersedes much of what came before.
And the source suggests the Boomer generation often lean towards
the hermeneutic of rupture, consciously or unconsciously, that their approach to the Council's implementation often reflected a desire for a break with the past.
Okay, and then the source asks a pretty deep theological question.
It does. It muses on whether the immense challenges faced by society and the Church could be seen, theologically, as a kind of divine chastisement, or maybe a trial permitted by God because his laws were being widely rejected.
That sounds heavy.
It is. It draws parallels to biblical stories where infidelity led to suffering. But, crucially, it immediately balances this by stressing God's infinite mercy and the constant possibility of repentance and renewal.
So, not a message of despair.
No, not at all. In fact, it explicitly points to remaining pockets of vibrant faith, especially among some younger Catholics, as real signs of hope. God hasn't abandoned his church.
Right. So, wrapping up this deep dive into the source, babyboomers.txt, the main takeaway seems to be the sheer speed and fundamental nature of the changes associated with that generation.
Yes, both in society at large and within the Catholic Church. A stark contrast is drawn with the seemingly more stable traditional era that preceded it.
And the source argues these changes were deeply interconnected and potentially unprecedented in their velocity and scope, at least in recent history.
That's the core thesis presented, which leaves us and our listeners with a significant question posed by the source itself.
Which is?
Considering everything we've discussed, these massive shifts, what does a path forward actually look like for Western culture, for the Catholic Church, Is the idea of rebuilding, which the source mentions, necessary? Possible?
And if so, what would be the first steps? Big questions.
Huge questions. It really invites personal reflection, doesn't it? What's our own role in all this? Where do we see signs of hope or possibilities for renewal today?
Absolutely. It shows how these historical shifts aren't just history. They're still shaping our present and undoubtedly our future. Thanks for exploring this complex source with us.